I was hired after a couple of years at the local station in Fort Worth and Dallas. I was hired by a headhunting firm for Metro Media. Metro Media was going to merge with the Transamerica Insurance Company, and they were going to become the fourth network. And so they began to assemble a Washington bureau. Well, they hired me to be a part of that. Well, by the time I got to Washington, the merger fell through and the financing fell through. And so I found myself working at the local station that Metro Media owned here in Washington. And it really was not as good a job as I'd had back in Fort Worth. So I went to my wife one day. We'd been here about 6 weeks, and I said, we have really made a terrible mistake. I said, I think we ought to go back to Fort Worth. And she said, well, in case you haven't noticed, I mean, this is literally true. She said, I happen to be pregnant. And she said, couldn't we at least wait until this baby comes before we move back to Fort Worth? And so I said, well, of course we can. And when I had gotten this job, I had just literally left her in charge of selling the house, moving, and all of that, and because I had to come up here to work. Well, while we were waiting for the baby to come, I had always wanted to work at CBS. I had, by that time, had applied at CBS for 5 years. Even when I worked at the Star-Telegram, I had, after I came back from Vietnam, I sent out letters to everybody, just, never could get an appointment at CBS. So because I couldn't get an appointment and I was afraid to ask for one, I just came over to this bureau here in Washington one morning, and walked in the door, went to the second floor, got off the elevator right there, and the first woman I saw, I said, I'm Bob Schieffer. I've come to see Bill Small about a job. Bill Small was the bureau chief. Well, oddly enough, she said, oh, yes, Bob, come right in. And I was ushered into the bureau chief's office. We had a long conversation, and as a result of that interview, I was hired later. But what was interesting, when I left the interview, I noticed this young man get off the elevator, and I recognized him from working at one of the local television stations here in Washington. I thought, oh no, he's come here to apply for a job too. Well, in 2002, when I was writing my book, This Just In, I called him because I'd always wondered about this, and I said, I want to ask you something. I said, in the spring of 1960, when was it, 1968? I called him, it was in the spring of 1969. I asked him, at that point, had you called Bill Small to see about going to work at CBS? And he thought about it, and he said, yeah, I think that's when it was, but said, nothing ever came of it. So NBC offered me a job, and so I went to work there. Well, it turned out it was Bob Hager, who was the longtime transportation correspondent for NBC News. And I had literally walked in on his appointment. The woman got her bobs mixed up. She thought I was him, and that's how I got in to see Bill Small. And so I always say, I was hired by accident. That's been about 38 years ago now. So I was a general assignment reporter, but I didn't really know. I just applied for a job, and I just applied for any job, working on the desk, whatever. And when Bill Small called me about 3 weeks after that, he said, we'd like to talk to you. And I said, about what? And he said, well, about going to work here. And I said, oh, well, I accept. And I was so excited that I just went in. I hung up the phone and went to see my boss at Metro Media and told him that I quit. I said, I'm going to work at CBS. And he said, really? And I said, yeah. Well, I got in my car to drive over to talk to Bill Small, and I got to wonder, well, I wonder if he hired me, or did he just tell me to come over here? And I was wondering, when I got here, I didn't know what he had hired me to do. Well, I came here. He offered me the job, luckily, and he took me out in the newsroom out there to introduce me to people, and he said, this is Bob Gregory's replacement. Well, I knew Bob Gregory. I'd heard him on the radio, so I knew that he was a correspondent, and that's how I knew I'd been hired to be a reporter, as we called it in those days. In those days, we had 22 correspondents and 4 reporters. And the reporters didn't have contracts. They were just hired and paid a weekly salary. And you got fees. If you did a TV story, you got $50. If you did a radio story, you got $25. And we had radio syndication. You got $12.50 for those. And so on the first year, I really worked hard. On a base salary of $200 a week, I'll never forget it, I made $33,000. I accepted every night assignment. I turned in a lot of radio stories because, you know, when you were the rookie in the Bureau, as I was, you didn't get many of the prime assignments for the CBS Evening News. But after I did that for about a year, they promoted me to a correspondent. And before I became a correspondent, one day they literally fired the Pentagon correspondent. And they sent me out to cover a news conference at the Pentagon. And this seemed like a great deal for me because it meant that this was in the days of all the war demonstrations. And we just got sent out every day covering these demonstrations. And this seemed great to me because it meant at least if I could somehow stay at the Pentagon, that I wouldn't have to cover these demonstrations on a 24-hour basis. So I really began lobbying hard and working hard to get the job as Pentagon correspondent. And in fact, they gave the job to me after a while, and I stayed at the Pentagon for 5 years. It was my first beat in Washington.